Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Downey and today we're going to discuss a RAD140 only cycle, and in this video we'll also discuss the kinetics regarding RAD140 and what it does to the body, side effects and things like that. So it's quite a common cycle nowadays with the popularization of SARMs. I see quite a few people doing it as a beginner cycle, and if you watch my previous RAD140 video, you'll see that it doesn't have a lot of clinical research, which is the slightly problematic thing with it. So if we were to grade it in terms of its research, it would be one of the lower tier SARMs. LGD and Ostarine have more data. Not to say that they have a lot though. So let's do a quick overview of the pharmacokinetics and dosages. So if you look at this graph, we can see that around the fourth hour is the peak, but it seems to get close to the peak at around the first hour. That's after ingesting it. And that peak lasts for approximately 5 hours. So when dosing it, it would be best to dose it close to the gym, and so you'd want to dose it around 2 hours before the gym, perhaps. Its half-life is 44.7 hours, so you could essentially do one dose every 2 days, but once a day would be best in order not to get those peaks and troughs. Dosages range from 5 milligrams to 30 milligrams. This is in terms of bodybuilding dosages, and duration commonly used is around 48 weeks. So in terms of side effects, SARMs are thought to be side effect free. This is definitely not the case. In fact, they seem to be a bit more side effect prone than common oral steroids and more milder steroids like testosterone. So, but the study I'll be using is one where they used higher doses ranging from 50 milligrams to 150 milligrams a day, which is a lot more than that which is used, but this just gives you an idea of the potential problems you could run into, but perhaps at a lesser extent. So in terms of the liver, at 50 milligrams a day, which isn't that much more than the highest dose that people tend to take, half of the patients had elevations of AST. They were pathological elevations, so above range. And this is interesting because it's not a C17 alpha alkylated steroid like most other oral steroids, which explain why other oral steroids are hepatotoxic, but this would suggest that RAD140 is hepatotoxic. So in terms of renal markers, so kidney markers, it would suggest that RAD is also not too safe on the kidneys. However, the patients in the study had dehydration, which in itself is a risk factor for skewed U and E's. So it's important to make sure you protect your kidneys on cycle. That's through controlling your blood pressure and protein intake as well as hydration. Psychiatric effects are actually quite pronounced in anecdotal reports and in the study. So insomnia was fairly common, as well as anxiety. They weren't that common, but I have seen it being reported on forums also. So just be aware of those two issues. Nausea does tend to occur. 72% of the patients had some kind of gastrointestinal disturbance, so it's important to perhaps take it with a meal if it is toxic to the gastrointestinal lining, and make sure there isn't an issue with your liver if those side effects occur. So in terms of hormones, it's always thought that SARMs are not suppressive. However, they definitely are. Unfortunately, there's no research on that, but anecdotal reports would suggest such as a problem, especially with RAD being, well, quoted as being one of the more suppressive SARMs. The problem with this is it leads to testosterone decrease and an eventual estrogen decrease that will decrease slower than the testosterone decrease, and thus you'll have symptoms of both low estrogen and low testosterone. So I've seen individuals recommend a aromatase inhibitor on cycle or an anti-estrogen of some sort. That's because at the beginning of the cycle you get this depression of testosterone, and then your testosterone to estrogen ratio at the beginning is a bit skewed, so you have low test compared to estrogen, and that itself can cause gyno even if your estrogen is in the normal range. So people have suggested to lower estrogen. However, I don't think that would be a good idea or approach. Just because although there's an imbalance, your estrogen is within the normal range, and by trying to decrease it, you're not going to have conversion to estrogen anymore because your testosterone's lower and you're decreasing your estrogen, so you're just creating more side effects for yourself. So instead, if you are worried about gynecomastia, I would suggest you lose body fat prior to initiating SARMs, and that you perhaps use the SARM-SERM protocol, so using a tamoxifen along with the SARM. So with that being said, a PCT is definitely necessary, and there does seem to be a dose-dependent effect on lipids. So LDL increases and HDL decreases, so watching your diet and cardiovascular exercise is important. In terms of muscle gains, we discussed this in the previous video on RAD. However, it's more or less similar to Anavar or any other steroid, except at higher dosages, it seems the effect of RAD seems to taper off and doesn't grow. It doesn't increase with the increase in dosage, whereas with other steroids they do increase. So perhaps I would suggest picking a different steroid instead, like Anavar, which has more research behind it, but I'm not suggesting you do either. So in summary, let's discuss how a RAD140 cycle would work. So it is possible, but you'd obviously have to take precautions, that with your hepatotoxicity and ensuring your mental health is good prior to initiating because of the psychiatric effects, and as well as making sure your blood pressure doesn't spike too much. I have seen anecdotal reports of blood pressure spikes which would damage the kidneys, so ensuring that's in range. So suppression, there are no studies, but there are anecdotes, so it's important to ensure you do a PCT afterwards, and during the cycle, it might be more beneficial to add a testosterone base so you don't experience those symptoms, and you perhaps get more gains, but you do get more suppression with the addition of testosterone. And to control gyno, I'd suggest a SERM, running a SERM alongside as opposed to an aromatase inhibitor. Again, PCT is definitely necessary, maybe a 4-week protocol with Clomid and Nolvadex. You can find many online. And just in terms of my closing thoughts, I think you should rather pick a compound with more research prior, if you're still considering whether to use RAD, perhaps use something like, I would preferably don't use anything because the gains are really minimal if you look at it from a longitudinal perspective. But if you are going down that route, I would suggest something like Anavar instead, which has more clinical research and thus predictability, and perhaps isn't as hepatotoxic as we discussed in the previous video. And there are not many human studies on RAD. In fact, there are only one, whereas we have meta-analyses on Anavar. So that's just an opinion, but let me know what you think in the comments below, and give this video a like if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.